Good morning, students. Today I am going to speak to you on Islam, its philosophy and its spread in India. I have divided this lecture into three major parts. First, I look at the meaning of Islam. We discuss its philosophy and the various practices which are associated with Islam. We also look at the spread of Islam in India, first under Delhi Sultanate and then under Mughal Empire, and we conclude by talking a little about the impact of Islam on India. Now, the literal meaning of the term Islam is peace, that is surrender of one's will, that is losing oneself for the sake of God and surrendering one's own pleasure for the pleasure of God. The meaning of Islam was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad nearly 1400 years ago, and it means submission to the will of Allah. And today, as we all know, Islam is one of the fastest growing religion, and it is the second largest religion in the world. The central teachings of Islam are derived from the Quran, which is their primary and sacred text, and it is very much based on the revelations which came about when Prophet Muhammad, who is regarded as the final prophet, revealed these, and he exemplifies human perfection. Prophet Muhammad, whose name is associated with Islam, was the son of Abdullah, the son of Abdul Muttalib, and he belonged to the tribe of Quraysh. He was born in Makkah 53 years before the Hijrah. As a young boy, Muhammad traveled with his uncle in the merchants' caravans to Syria, and some years afterwards, he made the same journey in the service of a wealthy widow named Khadija. So faithfully did he transact the widow's business, and so excellent was the report of his behavior, which she received from her old servant who had accompanied him, that she married him soon. And this marriage proved to be a happy one, though she was 15 years older than he was. Throughout the 26 years of their life together, he remained devoted to her, and after her death, when he took others' wives, he mentioned her with greatest love and reverence. This map shows you the places which are associated with the birth of Islam, and you can see the boundaries of Saudi Arabia, Makkah, Jeddah and Medina, which became very important sites in the spread of Islam. The first revelations to Muhammad came in a cave. It was Muhammad's practice to retire often to a cave in the desert for meditation. His place of retreat was Hira, a cave in a mountain called the Mountain of Light, which was not far from Makkah in the month of Ramzan. It was there one night towards the end of his quiet month that the first revelation came to him when he was 40 years of age. He heard a voice say, "Read." He said, "I cannot read." The voice again said, "Read." He said, "I cannot read." A third time the voice said, "Read in the name of the Lord who created man from clot. Read, and it is thy Lord, the most bountiful, who teacheth by the pen, teacheth man that which he knew not." And it was here that Muhammad eventually accepted the tremendous task which was imposed on him, and he became filled with enthusiasm of obedience. Today also we have the cave of Hira, which is referred to as the Mountain of Light, the Jabal al-Nur, and it is one of the holiest places which is visited by pilgrims. After this, for the first 3 years, the Prophet preached to his family and his intimate friends, while the people of Makkah as a whole regarded him as one who had become a little mad. He was not easily accepted by the people, and we find that his first convert was his wife Khadija. The second convert was his first cousin Ali, whom he had adopted, and the third was his servant Zaid, a former slave. His old friend Abu Bakr was also one among the earliest convert, and these were the first ulama that succeeded, the caliphs who succeeded him. At the end of the third year, the Prophet began to preach in public, pointing out the wretched folly of idolatry. It was then when he began to speak against the gods that the Quraysh became actively hostile. Till now they were keeping a very lenient kind of an attitude of wait and watch as to what he was saying. And slowly they started persecuting his poorer disciples, mocking and insulting him. The one consideration which prevented them from killing him was fear of the blood vengeance of the clan to which his family belonged. The converts of the first 4 years were mostly humble folks, unable to defend themselves against oppression. When they saw the persecution of the Prophet advised his followers to immigrate to a Christian country, Abyssinia. The idol worshippers of Kaaba, as guardians of the Kaaba, posted men on all the roads to warn the tribes against the madman who was preaching in their midst. They tried to bring the Prophet to a compromise, offering to accept his religion if he would so modify it to make room for their gods, as intercessors with Allah, offering to make him their king if he would give up on idolatry. The people in Kaaba were very upset that Muhammad was speaking against idol worship. His uncle Abu Talib was offered young men in place of Muhammad if only he would let them kill Muhammad, but Abu Talib refused. Even in his own clan, there were those who rejected his teachings, and many merchants actively opposed his message. So initially it was not easy for Muhammad to spread his message and get followers. We find that, however, this is the map of Abyssinia, which is modern day Ethiopia, where many of his followers migrated. But most of Arabia was converted to Islam by the time of Muhammad's death in 632. After Muhammad had preached publicly for more than a decade, the opposition to him reached a high pitch, and his followers were harassed, abused, and even tortured. At last, therefore, Muhammad sent 70 of his followers off to the northern town of Yathrib, which was later renamed as Medina. Later in the early fall of 622, he learned of a plot to murder him, and with his closest friend Abu Bakr, he sent off to join the emigrants. This was the Hijrah, which is translated as flight, from which the Muslim era is dated. In fact, the Hijrah was not a flight, but a carefully planned migration, which marks not only a break in history, the beginning of the Islamic era, but also for Muhammad and the Muslims, a new way of life. Henceforth, the organizational principle of the community was not to be mere blood kinship, but the greater brotherhood of all Muslims. The men who accompanied Muhammad on the Hijrah were called Muhajirins, those that made the Hijrah or the emigrants, while those in Medina became Muslims and were called Ansars or helpers. And these two groups, the Ansars and the Muhajirins, played a very important part in the early part of Islam when it was expanding. Now, as far as the whole concept of Allah is concerned and how the Muslims understand Allah, they have 99 names for Allah or God, and Prophet is seen as the link between the people and Allah. Abraham is the father of the Arab people, and Moses and Jesus are also revered. Muhammad is the last and the seers of all prophets, and Muslims consider human nature as essentially good. Sin occurs when people forget their natural goodness. The 5 important tenets of Islam are that one should have prayers 5 times a day, there should be fasting during the month of Ramzan, and there is also a concept of wealth sharing. One has to share 2.5% of their gross income, and pilgrimage to Makkah in one's person's life is emphasized upon, and there is a confession of faith in only one God and the acknowledgement that Muhammad as a unique prophet. So these are the basic 5 tenets of Islam which any follower of Islam has to practice and follow. They cannot move away from these 5 tenets. Now, the Quran is a very holy book for the Muslims. Muhammad's divine revelations continued till the end of his life. These revelations together make up the text of the Quran, the holy scriptures of Islam. And hadiths are regarded as narration of the Sunnah, and these are, the lived examples which Muhammad had during his lifetime. There are various social teachings also of Islam. The Sharia law or the divine law, it governs most of the Islamic countries today. Islam regards men and women as equals, but with different role. And it is interesting that for the first time when Islam came into being, unlike other religions in the world, Islam only recognizes a difference between a man and a woman. It says God has only made one difference, and that is between a man and a woman, and everyone else is created as an equal. At a time when women did not have any property rights, Islam gives them a right to property, and they also have a right to say yes or no in a marriage, because marriage is not seen as a ritual bond but as a contract. And jihad in Islam represents the struggle of the individual and society to act in accordance to the Sharia law. There is a lot of ritual prayers which a Muslim has to perform. They have to pray 5 times a day, and each prayer does not take more than a few minutes to perform. And you have various times at which these prayers are performed. The prayer at dawn is known as Fajr, at noon as Zohar, mid-afternoon as Asr, sunset as Maghrib, and the prayer at night is Isha. So you have to pray at these 5 times and remember the name of God. Here is a picture which shows you, which is something, a very common sight, Muslims at prayer. They pray in a communal way where everyone gathers together to pray. It's not an individualistic kind of prayer. The 5 prayers of Muslim practice are, there is a confession of faith, that is the Shahada, there are ritual prayers, the Salatat, and there is an obligatory alms, the Zakat, which has to be paid. They have to fast on Ramadan, the Psalm, and they have to go on a pilgrimage to Makkah, Hajj. And these practices become the 5 pillars of Islam. There is also a lot of emphasis on going on pilgrimage. Makkah becomes a very important center for the Muslims, and all over the world, Muslims travel to Makkah. In fact, if you look at some of the earliest kind of writing which came up in Islam were travel books, because everyone was visiting Makkah, and people who visited wrote a lot about flora and fauna, the other kinds of the locale, the culture of the people, and therefore you have a very different kind of literature which emerges in the beginning when Islam was spreading itself. Now slowly, using Medina as their base, we find that all Arabia came under Muhammad's control, and for the first time Arabia got an identity of its own. Prior to the coming of Islam, Arabia was known as Al-Zahiliya. It comprised of various tribal people, and each tribe had its own social system, its economic system, its own system of religion. Each believed in different practices, and they were never one together. They were mostly tribals and united by some common bond or blood relationship, but these were not very close. And it was when Islam came into being, for the first time, the Arab Muslims got an identity of their own, and Muhammad was regarded as a religious leader, a political ruler, and a military commandant. Right at its inception, Islam did not distinguish between political authority and religious authority. These two were combined as one, unlike Europe, where there was always a struggle between the king and the pope in medieval Europe, both of them using different kinds of argument to establish their power. In Islam, both the religious leader and the political leader become one, and therefore Islam never distinguished between the religious and the secular. Now Ramadan becomes a very important fast for the Muslim. It is the holiest period of Islamic year. It commemorates the 9th lunar month in the year 610, when revelations began from God via the angel Gabriel to Prophet Muhammad. These revelations in Arabic were memorized by Muhammad, and they were passed on orally, and it was only later that it was written down as Quran. And therefore, since this happened in the month of Ramzan, we find that the Muslim believes that the gates of heaven are open and the gates of hell are closed at this time. The devils are all chained up in hell, so they cannot tempt the believers on earth. And Muslims believe that because this month has been blessed by Allah, any good action during Ramadan will bring them a great reward. And so there is a lot of reverence during this period. Every year in the month of Ramzan, Muslims fast from dawn to sunset. They abstain from food, drink, and sexual relations. This is typically balanced by feasting during the dark hours of Ramzan. Now, there is also certain rules of Swam or Siyam, and especially, people who are sick, elderly, or on a journey, or women who are pregnant or nursing, they are not required to complete the entire fast. They can break the fast and make up for an equal number of days later in the year. They can also feed a needy person for every day they miss. So, it's a very scientific way of looking at things, because though Islam talks about in very strict terms about do's and don'ts, there are certain exceptions which are given, and one can follow them in the way the fast has to be practiced. Another very important aspect which had a lot of impact was they believe in giving alms, a specified percentage on certain properties to certain classes of needy people, and this percentage is worked out to be 2.5 of the gross income. People may also give as much or little as they wish in the form of voluntary alms or charity, and this is something which is practiced by many of the Muslim, and especially during the period of Ramzan, where a lot of charity is given. Now, Eid-ul-Fitr is a very important festival. It is called the festival of breaking of the fast, and it occurs after the month of Ramzan, when the people break their fast the moment they see the moon, and it shows the ending of the month of fasting, and we find that it is celebrated at the end of Ramzan, and it is a time for a lot of feasting and rejoicing. Fitr is derived from the word fatar, meaning breaking, and fitr has another meaning which is derived from another word, fitra, that is giving alms. So a lot of alms are given and people break their fast. You have special foods and delicacies which are prepared on this day. They are distributed among neighbors and friends. It's a time of lot of rejoicing, celebration. And we find that people visit each other's homes, they take part in festive meals, there are lots of special dishes, beverages and desserts which are prepared. The most common food item that is eaten during this month is vermicelli, which is cooked in sweet meat, sweet milk, and called sivaiya, it is one of the delicacies of Eid. Here you can see a celebration taking place during Eid and the sighting of the moon, which becomes very important to declare the beginning of the Eid-ul-Fitr. People send a lot of greeting cards to one another. Here is an example of few cards where they wish each other Eid Mubarak and greet one. Now let me talk a little about the Hajj. Now, Hajj is the pilgrimage which is taken by all the followers, and you find Muslims from all over the world. As you can see the volume in these two pictures, the number of people who visit the Hajj, and this is something which is done by a person. It is enjoined on a person to have pilgrimage. It is an obligation on a person that once in his or her lifetime they have to physically or financially be able to perform this pilgrimage. And in fact, every year about 2 million people go to Makkah from different corners of the globe. Now, there are a lot of preparations which are required before going on Hajj. Before setting out, a pilgrim should redress all the wrongs, they should pay away all their debts, and they should have plans to have enough fund for his or her own journey and for the maintenance of the family while he or she is away, and prepare him or herself for a good conduct throughout the Hajj. So, in that sense, though Islam is a religion, it also takes care about secular matters. A person who is going on Hajj has to make enough provision that his family behind is not led into any hardship, and only then he can take a pilgrimage and go to Hajj. And on the first day, the people visit of the Hajj, they go out of Makkah towards Mina. This is a small uninhabited village east of the city, and here the pilgrims spend most of their time in meditating and praying as the Prophet did on his pilgrimage. They try to follow the same path which the Prophet took, and as they are following him, they can almost relive the experiences which the Prophet had when he was on Hajj. The clothing of Hajj is also very important, because when the Muslims are undertaking the pilgrimage, they have to shed all signs of their wealth and societal distinction by donning simple white garments. These garments are called ihram, and the required pilgrimage dress for men is 2 white cloths, one of which covers the body from the waist downwards, and one which is gathered at the shoulder. Women also usually wear a simple white dress and a headscarf or their own native dress. The ihram is a symbol of purity and equality, and it signifies the pilgrim in a state of devotion. And what is very important, by seeing that people may come from different corners of the world, they may belong to different economic and social strata, they may belong to different sections of society, but when they come on pilgrimage, all of them don the same white cloth, which signifies equality before God. Then there are various rites which are followed during Hajj. There is ablution as before prayer time. They have to absent themselves from any killing, sexual activity, even cutting of hair and nail is not allowed during this period. Now, Kaaba, which draws a large number of people to this pilgrimage, every year it is beautifully draped with cover, and each Arab nation provides these drapes to cover Kaaba for the Hajj. Now, if you read some of the writings, it really takes you back into that period. And I will read out something for you, people who reflect on the Kaaba. And a writer says, to touch and kiss the stone is to travel back in time and follow the footsteps of all those pious and noble greats in history who have touched it. It is not easy to do that, though. It seems there are always too many people ahead who are trying to do the same. The closest we came to it was about 10 feet, and then we raised our hand in salutation to say, God is great. So, there is so much crowd, but in spite of that, each and every single person is going through that emotion. They feel that, they are a chain of that long continuity of people who travel to this place right from the time of Prophet Muhammad. So, they partake in this kind of an experience. Kaaba is one of the holiest places of Islam, but it was not built by its last prophet Muhammad. Tradition has it that Kaaba was originally built by Prophet Adam and was rebuilt by Prophet Ibrahim, that is Abraham, and his eldest son, Prophet Ismail, nearly 4,500 years ago. Another very important part of the Hajj is the well of Zamzam. The well of Zamzam is located within the Masjid of Haram in Makkah, and it is 20 kilometers east of Kaaba. According to legend, Ismail around the year 2000 BC was desperately seeking for water for an infant son, but could find none, as Makkah is located in a dry valley. Muslim tradition says that Hajar ran several times back and forth in the scorching heat between the two hills of Safa and Marwa looking for water. God then sent angel Gabriel, who dug a hole in the ground and caused the spring to appear. Hajar confined the pool of water with sand and stone. So every pilgrim visits this place. And if we read again, some of the writings which talk about their experiences, one writer says, as we drink from Zamzam, we know that it is the same well that sprang up in the middle of the desert, so Hagar and Ismail could drink from it. So, you almost have the pilgrims sharing their experiences and partaking a similar kind of experiences which many had had before them. After this is followed the festival of sacrifice, because they cast pebbles, then most of the pilgrims sacrifice a goat, sheep or some other animal. They give up the meat to the poor and in many cases they keep a small portion for themselves. Again, as a sign of humility that they have come to Hajj, they have completed their pilgrimage, we find that men either shave their head or clip their hair, and women cut off a symbolic lock to mark their partial deconsecrations. This is done as a symbol of humility. All prescription, save the one on conjugal restriction, is now removed. And now, you know, the end of Hajj is marked by Eid-ul Adha, which, you know, it's called the formal pilgrimage to Makkah. During the end of the Hajj period, Muslims sacrifice either a goat or sheep, which signifies the time when Prophet Abraham was about to sacrifice his own son to prove his obedience to God, but God replaced his son with an animal. So, you know, they partake in this experience which occurred many thousands of years before. And it is obligatory on the part of a Muslim to perform the Hajj at least once in a lifetime. Now, if we look at the spread of this civilization, within 1 century after Muhammad's death, Islamic civilization spread throughout Middle East, Persia, North Africa, and almost all of Spain. Currently, if we look at it, the greatest concentration of Muslims is across the northern half of Africa, all of Middle East, Southwestern and South Asia, and the island of Malaysia and Indonesia. In fact, Islam is one of the growing religion of the world. It's also fastly growing in United States. You know, this map shows you, it's a map of the world which shows you where the Muslims are concentrated all over the world. And you can see that Islam has spread to a large number of regions. Now, the reason, you know, how do we explain this expansion of Islam? Definitely, you know, the teachings of Islam played a major role in its spread. It is something which is very easy to learn and practice. There is no concept of a priesthood in Islam. Islam teaches equality. Like I have mentioned before, the Quran says the only distinction God has made is between a man and a woman, and everyone else is equal before the eyes of God. It treats all the non-Muslims as people of the book, and they are allowed religious freedom, but they have to pay additional taxes. And Islam was something which was easily portable. If you look at history, you know, it followed nomads who were moving out, it followed various trade routes, a large number of merchants who brought Islam to different countries. And then, you know, there is also the concept of jihad or holy war against pagans or other non-believers who are regarded as infidels. Now, let me talk a little about the spread of Islam in India. Contrary to the popular belief that it was the Muslim rulers who brought Islam into India, we find that Islam came into South Asia prior to the Muslim invasion in India as early as 7th century with the advent of Arab traders. The Arab traders used to visit the Malabar region, which was a link between them and the ports of Southeast Asia, to trade even before Islam had been established in Arabia. According to the historian Eliot and Dowson, in their book, The History of India, as told by its own historians, the first ship bearing Muslim travelers was seen in the Indian coast as early as 630 AD. And H.G. Rawlinson, in his book, Ancient and Medieval History of India, also claims that the first Arab Muslims settled on the Indian coast in the last part of 7th century AD. So therefore, you know, this belief that Islam came about with the kings, you know, the Muslim kings, the slave dynasty which was established, is really not true. You had a large number of these Arab traders who were coming into India, and they brought Islam with them. In 8th century, we have the Arab invasion of Sindh which took place, and Sindh is today in Pakistan, and we find that at that time it was conquered by an Arab army led by Muhammad bin Qasim, and Sindh became the easternmost province of the Umayyad Caliphate. So this was the first contact with the Umayyads had with India at this time. This was soon followed by Muhammad of Ghazni. His period is between 1001 to 1026. He had nearly 17 invasions in India. He came from Afghanistan and he is regarded as an idol breaker. So you had a large number of incursions into the territory by Muhammad Ghazni at that time. And we also have the fight between Anandpal and in 1008 in Peshawar, and according to legend, the Muslims relied a lot on cavalry, on the horses, and the horses were much more swift, and Indians relied a lot on elephants, which were, though they were very effective in war, but the movement was much more slow when compared to a horse. And Anandpal was seated on an elephant, and when an arrow struck the elephant, it made run, and in the whole turmoil, people thought that their king had fallen from the howdah of the elephant and he was no longer visible, and they thought that they had lost the war, and easily victory was achieved. And Muhammad Ghori was able to establish himself in India. Now, after Muhammad Ghori left, he made Qutbuddin Aibak, who was a slave from Turkestan, in charge of Indian affairs. And Qutbuddin Aibak was followed by Iltutmish, and Iltutmish ruled for a short period, but he tried to stabilize the Delhi Sultanate in India, and he had many sons, but he found them very unworthy, and he made his daughter Razia Begum as the queen who would succeed him, and she came into power in 1236 AD. And we find that she, after a brief power struggle, she lost her throne by 1240, and when she was killed. After her death, Nasiruddin Mahmud came to power and we find that Balban took over power from him. The slave dynasty was immediately followed by the Khiljis, the Tughlaqs, the Sayyids and the Lodhis. You had a large number of people who were ruling, and we find some kind of a establishment came as a result of this. We find that after the death of Balban, the Sultanate had become very weak. There were a large number of revolts, and this was a period when Jalaluddin Khilji came to the throne, and he established the Khilji dynasty, and then it was followed by his nephew Alauddin Khilji, and we find that Alauddin Khilji started a long line of conquest. He marched into Gujarat, Ranthambore, and he in 1303 AD he also conquered Chittor, killing Rana Ratan Singh and his queen Rani Padmini, and a large number of other women committed Johar at this time. By 1305, Alauddin Khilji had captured Malwa, Ujjain, Mandu, Dhar and Chanderi, but he was not able to capture Bengal. By 1311, he captured nearly the whole of North India. His general Malik Kafur played a major role, and he moved into a large part of Deccan. The Mongols invaded the country several times and they were successfully repulsed. One of the major problems which the Delhi Sultanate had to face was the constant invasion by the Mongols on the northwestern frontier. And we find that Alauddin Khilji learnt his lessons. He also tried to fortify himself, and he organized an armed force. He is well known for a large number of market reforms which he brought in, the reforms in the army, which strengthened the Delhi Sultanate, and he was able to achieve a lot, and he died in 1316. After the death of Alauddin Khilji, we find that Mubarak Khan, the third son of Alauddin Khilji, ascended the throne, and again he was followed by Qutbuddin Mubarak. Qutbuddin Mubarak's reign was a total failure, and he was murdered by Khusru Khan, and the Khilji dynasty ended. At this time in 1320 AD, Ghazi Tughlaq, the governor of the northwest frontier province, took the throne under him, and under the title of Ghayasuddin Tughlaq. He killed Khosrow Khan, whom they did not regard as a real ruler. And we find during the Tughlaq period, the territorial expansion of Delhi Sultanate reached great height. His empire covered regions from Peshawar in the north to Madurai in the south, and from Sindh in the west to Assam in the east. He also had various reforms. He tried to transfer his capital from Delhi to Devgiri because he thought Devgiri was more centrally situated than Delhi. But this step was not very successful, and he had to soon order to return his army back to Delhi. And we find that he also tried to introduce copper and brass coins as token coins, and we find that as a result of this coins, he also had to there were various administrative blunders, military failures on his part. But Muhammad bin Tughlaq never practiced Islam very seriously. He tried to keep the ulama at a distance, and in his time there was some kind of a secular environment that was created. Then we find that Firoz Tughlaq succeeded him, and he constructed various buildings with architectural skill. And the last Tughlaq ruler was Muhammad Nasiruddin, who ruled from 1395 to 1413. This was a period where Timur invaded Delhi, and he destroyed a large number of temples in northern India. Thousands of people were killed and plundered. The Tughlaq dynasty was followed by the Sayyids, and the last dynasty was of the Lodhis. Behlol Lodhi was in the service of Khijr Khan, and he was the founder of the Lodhi dynasty. After his death, Sikandar Lodhi succeeded to the throne, and the last ruler of this empire was Ibrahim Lodhi, who faced the battle with Babur, and Babur defeated Ibrahim Lodhi in the battle of Panipat. And we find now, with the coming of Babur, you know, by the end of 16th century, the first phase, we could say the second phase of the establishment of the Islamic rule had ended. The first was with the coming of the Arab invasion of Sindh, the second was with the Delhi Sultanate, and third, now you have the Mughal dynasty which is established. The Mughal rulers were more secular in their outlook. They did not see religious conversion as their main aim, and they were more interested in establishing their hegemony and controlling the wealth of India. Babur ascended the throne in 1526, and in the beginning of his rule, we find that he had to face a large number of problems from the Rajputs and Afghan chiefs. He also battled with Rana Sanga in 1527 in the battle of Khanwa, and Rana Sanga lost the battle. And we find that Babur was able to extend his empire from Behra and Lahore to Bahraich and Bihar, and from Sialkot to Ranthambore. Like his predecessors, Babur continued a policy of having a kind of tolerance to the local population. And we find that though the Afghans were defeated, they were not vanquished, and they continued to plunder. You know, this is one of the Purana Kilas of Babur, and which is in Delhi. But Babur really did not have a very long reign, and we find that he was succeeded by his son Humayun. Humayun's period is between 1530 to 1556, but he had a very troubled time because of Sher Shah, and we find that Sher Shah was a very capable military and civilian administrator. He was able to drive out Humayun, and finally, you know, Humayun had to spend a lot of his time in roaming outside Delhi, and by 1556 he died because of an accidental fall. It was after the death of Humayun that in the period of Akbar, who ruled between 1556 to 1605, that we saw, you know, he emerged as one of the greatest Mughal rulers. And it was in this period for the first time that Islam started becoming more and more Indianized in the Indian environment. Akbar followed a policy of reconciliation with the Rajputs. He won their support by establishing matrimonial alliances with them. In 1562, he married the eldest daughter of Raja Bihalmal of Jaipur. In 1584, his son Salim was married to the daughter of Raja Bhagwan Das. And we find that in 1567, he marched against Chittor. And Chittor was captured, and by 1569, Ranthambore and Kalanjar were also captured. So, you know, wherever he could, he established a policy of reconciliation. He tried to bring in the Rajputs into his fold, and if they did not agree, he followed by a policy of war. Akbar's policy was generally a very tolerant policy towards the Hindus, and he started a new sect called Teen-e-Ilahi, and Akbar was followed by his son Jahangir. You know, this is a miniature painting which shows the birth of Jahangir's son and in 1590, and the rejoicing which takes place. Now, by and large, Akbar followed a policy of reconciliation with the Rajputs, and he won a lot of support by establishing matrimonial alliances. As I have already mentioned, he married the daughter of Raja Bihalmal of Jaipur. His son Salim was married to the daughter of Raja Bhagwan Das, and wherever he could not get support, he followed a policy of war. Akbar is also known to have built beautiful architectural designs, which and this is Diwan-e-Khas, which was the hall of Akbar's audience, and this was the Deen-e-Ilahi, where he practiced his new faith. This was a new religion, one that incorporated both the common and the best elements of world religion. You know, he was very much, though an illiterate, he was very curious and he was very much interested in knowing about the different religions of the world. And he tried to have religious syncretism not only through marriage alliances, but also through understanding the philosophy of different regions. One of the dream projects of Akbar was Fatehpur Sikri. And even today, if you go to Fatehpur Sikri, it comes across as a model of the policy of cultural fusion of Akbar. In its architecture, Fatehpur Sikri combines a lot of the Muslim and Hindu traditional elements. We find that, you know, it borrowed a lot of the Hindu styles from Gujarat, from Rajasthan, the kinds of designs which are there. Yet, Fatehpur Sikri was a dream project of Akbar, and it only lasted for 20 years and it had to be abandoned within this short time. Most probably it was due to the shortage of water, and today Fatehpur Sikri is a very quiet and deserted place. Another very important ruler was Jahangir, who was born of a Hindu mother. So by this time Islam is totally Indianized, and we find that Jahangir was the first emperor who was ruling India when the first Europeans came into India, and he is associated with building the Sikandra, that is the tomb of Akbar. And here are two miniature paintings which depict Shah Jahan and Mumtaz Mahal. Shah Jahan followed Jahangir. His period is between 1627 to 1658. Shah Jahan is credited with the construction of Taj Mahal, which is one of the wonders of the world. And another very last important ruler was Aurangzeb, whose period is between 1658 to 1707. But Aurangzeb was not very popular with the people. He followed Islam very strictly. He did not have a very secular understanding of Islam. He banned music, and he himself was a very devout follower of Islam. So he faced a lot of resistance from Marathas, especially Shivaji, and throughout his life he remained unsuccessful in subduing the Marathas. It was in about 1600 that the Mughals were able to establish contacts with the English, and this happened ever since the visit of Sir Thomas Roe. And in 1616 the English were permitted to build factories at Machilipatnam. And so, you know, before Aurangzeb died in 1707, we already had the English presence in India. He was succeeded by Bahadur Shah first, who was the eldest of the three surviving sons of Aurangzeb. However, the Mughal Empire did not remain very powerful after the death of Bahadur Shah. And Bahadur Shah first was known as Prince Muazzam, and he had to face a large number of problems throughout his reign. You know, he had to face problems from the Marathas, the Rajputs, and the Sikhs. The Mughal rule in Delhi continued under a number of weak rulers after the death of Bahadur Shah first, and by 1712 we find that the great Mughal Empire had disintegrated. The Mughal rule in Delhi while under Muhammad Shah witnessed the invasion of Nadir Shah in 1739, and this invasion sealed the fate of Muhammad Shah. This was followed by another invasion, Ahmad Shah Abdali, who was the general of Nadir Shah. And like the Timur invasion in the Sultanate period, the invasion of Nadir Shah and Ahmad Shah Abdali also created a lot of havoc. It led to a lot of plundering and looting and deleting the natural wealth of India. What is very important is, as I have shown in this long history, while the Muslim kings ruled in India for about 8 centuries, there was no enforced widespread conversion during this period. We have enough historical proof to show that there was no forced conversion, and most of these theories which were propounded in the modern period, in a period when there was a demand for a separate Pakistan, and both nationalists and the anti-nationalist authors were fighting for a separate state, and the history became a very important tool in the spread of communalism. What was very important to the rulers prior to that phase, when there is a demand for a separate state and when a lot of communalism comes in, stability was something which was very important for these rulers, and conversion as such was not an important step in this direction. They were more interested in having stability in their empire. So what is very important is, while all these rulers ruled under Islamic terms, Muslim rulers left the laity alone. And whatever few conversions took place were primarily voluntary. You know, a large number of Sufis played a major role, and many people got influenced by the Sufis and they got converted. A few conversions which must have taken place at the top rung of the ladder, to be very close to the Sultan or the Emperor, must have been done voluntarily, because we really do not have much evidence of forceful conversion taking place. And therefore, you know, if we look at it in the long run, the impact of Islam on Indian culture has been tremendous. It permanently influenced the development of all human endeavor, whether it is the language, dress, cuisine, all art forms, architecture and urban designs, even social customs and values. Conversely, the language of the Muslim invaders was modified by contact with the local language to Urdu, which uses the Arabic script, and the more colloquial Hindustani, which uses the Devanagari script. Amir Khusro played a major role in the spread of Hindustani, and today both Urdu and Hindi continue to be the major languages in India. And therefore, you know, through this lecture, we have taken you through the whole journey of how Islam was born, what were its basic principles, what are its major belief systems, and why Islam became very popular among the people. And in the second part, we were talking about the coming of Islam into India, and how in the first phase you had the Arab invasion of Sindh which took place, which was very temporary. Then we had the Delhi Sultanate which was established, followed by the Mughal dynasty which played a major role, and by the time of Akbar, Islam becomes very Indianized. And towards the end, we look at the impact of Islam on Indian culture and society.